Good morning, how are you? I'm Ivan.
Good morning, Ivan. This is Carrie with Purple Patch and the Performance Reset. I will be facilitating some questions your way so that you don't have to run up and down to look at the chat. It looks like you have Zach there to support as well. So if anyone has specific questions for you right now, please just drop them in the chat and we'll get going. It looks like Ted has a question actually about your virtual fitting. He's asking, which program should we choose, and how do you price it if they're getting fit for both a road and a tri-bike? And then, explain a little bit about that process.
Yeah, sure thing. So this process that we have is really a kind of a starting point. It's an audit for our riders, particularly if they can't come in here to the studio to us. So I would say that it's kind of broadly speaking, it's a consultation. It's not limited to one type of a bike, but we just need to be practical about how much we want to take on in an hour. So our online consultation is a couple of $100, and we will audit the kind of position, given the bike that you're most interested in working on, establish what kind of the history of that riding position has been and what you're trying to achieve, and then begin to start giving the riders some guidelines on what changes we make. So it really is like a standard fit process, but it's been so varied and it's been really interesting for us. We've helped people to use Allen wrenches, to use a measuring tape, to kind of really get into knowing the kind of nuts and bolts of their bike. We audit some video that they'll upload for us, so we're prepared before we hop on the call with them. We have them fill out a questionnaire, we audit some video, and then we're kind of ready to talk to them in the kind of live session. I would say it's probably most suitable to just focus on one bike in an hour, otherwise it will be maybe too condensed. But that's not to say that if somebody wants a kind of a quick guideline on, let's say, saddle height and setback for their road bike compared to their tri-bike, that we'd obviously share that information with them as well. So you can book the service online on our website and select a time that kind of suits yourselves, and then we reach out to the customer with our questionnaire and the instructions on how to upload video.
Great. This next question is for Kurt, and every Sunday morning should start off with this phrase. Is crotch chafing more of a saddle issue or a bike bib short issue?
Yeah, it can probably be compounded by saddle shape and saddle height. And then, when it comes to the rider, the skin, the material, whether they're using chamois cream, that gets very individual. So let's just talk about it, let's cover all of them. So saddle shape is going to be pretty critical, okay? Because we have to load a large percentage of our body weight into our sit bones. And it's not just our sit bones, it can be our pubic bones as well. So I'll get a quick model for this, and I'll just show you that, when you think of the rider and how they sit, you're talking about these two main sit bones. Now I'll give you a side aspect to where the rider will sit on the sit bones, and then they'll rotate forward onto the pubic bones. So this is the kind of movement that takes place. I'll get a saddle just to show you. You think of a saddle shape, hold this one to the right so you can kind of see it. It's a little dark behind me, but get the idea that it's a kind of a curved saddle, okay? And it has a cutout as well, so you can see that this will relieve some soft tissue pressure. This is a popular saddle, good saddle, that when the rider sits on it, that they can get relief of soft tissue and they can get support on the sit bones. And when they rotate forward onto the pubic bones, that they're still getting support. As you can see, the channel there in the saddle, the cutout. So that's important, that the shape of saddles, I'll try not to give Zach a heart attack here now with the zooming in and zooming out, but it's important that the shape of the saddle is going to be the foundation for comfort. And the best way that people can kind of establish suitability is to try different saddles. So saddle shape. The next thing would be, there's a small adaptation period. It could be 3 to 4 rides, to where you might be a little tender, you can feel your sit bones, and what you're feeling at the sit bone is just a skin fold. So it's just a skin fold over the bone, and that skin fold, no different to maybe gardening where you're raking leaves. You have to just generate a little bit of callousness at times at the sit bone to ensure that it's just not tender. So you transition from tender to not concerning yourself about it. If it's more than that, likelihood is the saddle is not really suitable for you. Chamois are important. Chafing is important to manage with some saddle cream and so on. So I would say that they're well done, but that wouldn't help if the saddle wasn't suitable. And the last thing is the saddle position. Like, obviously it makes sense to people if the saddle is too high, that it's going to force your hips a little bit more from side to side. And that's going to increase the rate of friction. And then another thing that can impact it is your power to weight ratio. So if riders are, let's say, quite lean, they're putting out, moderate to high power, there's actually not a lot of saddle pressure left. If somebody's starting out in the sport and they're not very fit and they're carrying some extra weight and their power is a little bit lower, then saddle comfort can be a little bit harder to find in those earlier stages. But don't just toughen through it. Try to do the process of elimination on saddle shape and suitability, optimize the height, have a good quality chamois because we spend enough time in it, and use some kind of chamois cream that I think just makes sense and helps with chafing and helps with heighting.
Awesome. Cameron's asking, how often should one get a bike fit, even if you've already been? Is there a good time to get
Yeah, a lot of bike fitters would say every year, I need to see you every year, but it's not that. I would say realistically what it is how is your position in relation to your goals? I kind of keep coming back to that. But let's just say Cameron came in for a bike fit and he was doing his first triathlon. He came in spring of 19. And then he had a great 19 and he executed a couple of races and he's getting more competitive in 20. Surely we have to revisit the position to try and optimize it going from completion to competing, if that makes sense. So his position may over time get a little bit more aggressive. He might be focusing on power, he might be focusing on aerodynamics. It can go the other way. Somebody could have had a very solid career and then now is just spending less time in the bike and races more recreational. And they just want a bit more comfort. They're not trying to be on the podium, they're not trying to qualify for Kona. So due to their training, maybe commitments going down a little, we can soften the position and make it a little bit more conservative. And then the other simple things are you have to work around injuries if riders are dealing with injuries, or you have to work around fluctuations if they're prone to putting on a lot of weight or become inflexible, then you might have to look at that. So really it's either when the rider changes or their goals change, you might need to revisit your fit. But with the right kind of roadmap from the start, we actually would kind of prescript what we'd expect their progress to be. And we often give people homework from our bike sessions, and that homework might be, okay, your A race is next May. Here we are in November. You're going to spend a lot of the time on the trainer. We're not focusing much on aerodynamics and riding outside. So let's focus on good suitability for generating power and a position that will allow you to adapt to, say, an aero position. And then in January, we're going to begin the progression towards your race position. So you've set your baselines for power, you've set your baselines for tolerance, just like staying in the position for that length of time. And now with more outdoor riding from February to May, we're going to make the front end a little bit more aggressive, or we're going to evolve the position that will try to maximize kind of for speed. Now that you've achieved what I would say a sustainability in a position. So hopefully there's a few examples of why you should revisit it, but it needs to be part of a roadmap.
Great. Jason is asking that in your presentation, you talked a little bit about sitting in multiple positions, and you've already touched on that here. What are some of the primary recommendations for alternate positions, side to side, forward, rearward? What do you suggest?
Sure, side to side doesn't really work unless you're cornering, right? And I suppose because there's just, if you think of this midline where I'm showing you my hand, side to side just changes the weighting of the bike so much that there's not a lot available there. What there is available is there's an availability to move forward and back, and there's an availability to change your posture, okay? So we understand that if you think of, again, going to saddle comfort, if you're riding rolling terrain, you don't sit in the same spot. If you're riding variations of wind, like gusts of wind and things like that, you don't ride in the same spot. And that holds true to racing, as does training. Also, when you're trying to maintain power at a certain level, as a byproduct, your position will begin to start decoupling, is a way to describe it. So if I say to somebody, all right, what's your kind of race pace? And they'll say, oh, it's 220 watts. Right, I want you to do four times 250 watts for 15 minutes at a time. You're not going to sit perfectly still at 250 watts. You're going to have to change the cadence, change your position on the saddle. A lot of people understand that as you move forward on the saddle, you change your center of gravity over the pedal stroke. And that can help with applying more tangential force to the power phase. So you'll see riders moving forward and back a little, trying to maintain high power while giving certain muscle groups a little bit more recovery. So in a real basic way, I'd say you could sit back, you could drive your heel, and you could lower your cadence to access more glute contraction and glute contribution. But you need to be able to maintain your core and the angle of your sacrum. You can't just let yourself slouch. You still need to be engaged. And then you can come forward and you can sit more on the tip of the saddle and you can increase cadence and maybe you can hold higher power, but then after a certain period of time, your quads are not getting the same extension at the knee. So they're going to tell you sit back, sit back. So I will summarize it by saying, moving around strategically to access different muscle groups or to beat the elements, whether it's riding hills or whether it's riding crosswinds, that's strategic movement that blends with cadence, power, and posture. The alternate to that, the one we don't want riders doing, is squirming. They're squirming around, they're not comfortable, so they're moving a lot. So they're the two kind of, figure out which class you're in. Are you able to ride a saddle and are you able to use more real estate, if that makes sense? So you can say, hey, I'm pretty comfortable sitting centered on this saddle. And I sit up to a centimeter or maybe two more. When I'm climbing, I'm sitting further back, I've lower cadence. And sometimes when I'm holding a wheel and I'm hiding behind somebody and it's high power, I'm out on the nose and I'm keeping my upper body really low. So there are reasons why you move on the saddle, and there's good reasons, and then there's reasons where it's just not suitable and you're squirming.
And this may be an extension of your explanation. It's a question from Rebecca, who talks about how she has a lot of soreness in her hip flexors when she's riding her tri-bike and doesn't have those same issues when she's on a road bike. So would that potentially be a bike fit issue or riding style, flexibility, all of the above?
Kind of all of the above, but here's the thing. Just when you think of the two positions, for Rebecca, when she's on her road bike, she's a lot more open at the hip. So her torso is 45 degrees to the horizon, we'll say. When she's on her tri-bike, she might be 25. And that just immediately closes the hip angle, maybe 20 degrees or so. And so there's a change, there's a change in a road position to a tri position. And you have to understand that if that change is too significant, it might be beyond what the rider is comfortable with. So that's one thing, that there is a demand between the two positions. It could be a thing that her tri-bike is maybe a little bit too aggressive. It could be a thing that she hasn't spent a lot of time in her tri-bike, and it could be a thing that with the position she has in her tri-bike, she might need to do a little bit more off the bike work to prepare her for that. So before she hops on her tri-bike and she's doing a session, she might have to do some hip openers, she might have to do some hamstring length and some lower back kind of mobility stuff, just to take the stress off the hip. Because genuinely you're kind of talking about glute kind of tightness, hip flexor tightness, and quad tightness. And the last one is kind of QL and lumbar spine. If any of those are tight and you put yourself in this folded position, you're going to kind of reach a kind of a point of stress before you even start riding, before you start putting out power. So I'd probably audit her position on how suitable is her tri position, and are the fundamentals of the tri position well set up. So where's her saddle height? What's that saddle height like in relation to crank length? And then how is the height and reach of the front end in relation to where that saddle position is? And then are they suitable to how she is off the bike? So using the online consultation as an audit, as a kind of a consideration, we would take the key measurements off her bike, including crank length and saddle position. We would have her perform 3 or 4 flexibility tasks that would tell us a little bit about her. And we would also be able to compare her road and tri position against each other, so that she would understand that maybe her road position is conservative and maybe her tri position is aggressive, and there's just too much of a gap between them. So that's kind of, we'd have to get into the nuts and bolts of it to understand specifically for her whether it's position or a combination. But generally speaking, riders are naturally more comfortable in road positions because they're not forcing themselves into forward flexion, and they're not dealing with more acute hip angles.
There you go, Rebecca. Simple, right? Let's move down to the to the feet. I've received a few questions about the footbeds and also midsole cycling shoes. So we'll start with footbeds. Howard is just asking your opinion and thoughts around footbeds in general.
Yeah.
Do you have?
Yeah, let's take it from the pure beginner all the way up. And let's just say like that pure beginners are doing a little bit of time on the bike, not a lot of time, so maybe footbeds aren't critical. And they could be fine in like a stock footbed. If you take a brand like CD, their insole is tiny, just a tiny little flimsy little piece of EVA. If you look at other brands, they might have choices in the footbed where you can change out the arch support and kind of detail that maybe more suitable to your own feet. I think footbeds become more important as you do more time and you're looking at comfort and performance. So that's kind of suitable to think of it in that regard. The other reason where you fast track thinking about it and looking at feet is if the rider is kind of symptomatic, if they're uncomfortable. Then even if they're only riding for 4 hours a week, 2 hours a week, we can address that and can make some big changes to the enjoyment. Because when you're loading most of the force through the ball of your foot, it's no fun when that like phase, that power phase in the downstroke is essentially you're yielding from it. It's kind of like you're limping into each downstroke. So what you can do there is you can look at, well, what's the structure of your foot and what kind of support does it need? How mobile is your foot compared to how rigid is your foot? And those kind of characteristics then kind of narrow into what type of footbed would suit you. But I think all people can benefit from even weight distribution in the foot. It doesn't have to be just into the big toe. It doesn't have to be on the lateral border of your foot. There certainly doesn't need to be reasons why your toes are going to sleep or why you're getting these hot spots. I think largely a lot of those can be resolved with shoe suitability, good full contact arch support, which just means from a pressure loading and a pressure mapping standpoint, there's just better distribution. And then cleat placement is something else as well that can have a little bit of an impact on it. But I would say that for kind of isolated in the shoe issues, you have to look at the shoe and look at the footbed. So just kind of know that there's entry and kind of intermediate and expert ways that you can support your foot inside the shoe, and those decisions should be driven on whether you're symptomatic or whether you're chasing comfort and performance. Go on to the midfoot.
Yeah, and similarly, Jerome is asking, what do you think about midsole cycling shoes?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's no science there that says it's more efficient or it's more powerful. It's just another way to consider applying force to the pedal stroke and what role does the foot have in relation to generating force. So let's think of it this way to kind of humor some of the nerds out there in relation to the biomechanics. So you've got your femur, you've got your shin, and you've got your foot segment. 3 segments that work together as levers to apply force. The largest group muscles are your glutes and your quads, then your hamstrings, and then your lower limb muscles. So we want to get, I would say there's different schools of thought, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit more complicated. But let's take a practical approach that each of these muscle groups are of a different size and can contribute different proportions of power. So the common sense approach would be, well, proportionately, the glutes, if they were working, at the same rate as the quads and as the calves, the glutes are just going to give more power. So you would want that kind of muscular contribution to the pedal stroke. Where midfoot has come from, one reason that it's kind of generated a little bit of following is when you look at the shin segment and you look at the foot segment, and when you think of the cleat that's under the foot, the further back the cleat goes, the less movement takes place in the ankle joint. The less movement that takes place in the ankle joint means the less the calves contribute to the pedal stroke. So simplified theory would be, right, let's go midfoot, let's not use the calves, and we'll have them for the run. It's kind of fine, but nobody goes back to their coach and says, because we're not now using the calves, we're going to dial back our power and we're just going to rely on the other muscle groups. If somebody is riding at 220 watts for an Ironman and they go to midfoot and the calf and the TA muscle don't contribute any power, then the glutes, quads and hamstrings have to make up the difference. So it still has to come from somewhere. So it's not like going to midfoot gives you a free ride to save power. It just means that those other muscle groups have to work harder. So we've had some scenarios where riders go to midfoot and then they're kind of really dealing with fatigue in the quads, or they're really dealing with fatigue in another area. I think it needs to be very measured. I think it needs to be done in an off season. I think it needs to be done where you're going to see how well you adapt to it. And that will be done on the logic that you're trying to protect the calves. Some people might do it based on symptomatic aspects. If you have a rider who has a torn Achilles, who has a very difficult soleus that they're trying to manage, or a calf muscle that they're trying to manage, they may want to maintain their training with putting as little stress as possible on it. I could understand that as being an approach as well. But the reason that it hasn't been more widely accepted is because the foot lever can act as a lever. And when you take that kind of rotational pivoting aspect around the pedal away, it means you have one less tool in your quiver when it comes to managing pedal stroke. So there's pros and cons, and I'd love to get into it more with it specifically, but I've given you a couple of reasons why people are going to midfoot. One is trying to save calves, 2 could be symptomatic, and I think it might work for a very small percentage of people. I'm not averse to trying it, but it needs to be done in the right circumstances.
Great. James has some shoes that are over 7 years old. Is there a standard lifespan for bike shoes?
I don't think so, and I'm like a farmer's son from Ireland, so I don't throw anything out. They could be absolutely fine, it depends on how well people look after things. There's another misconception as well, that shoes have to be stiffer, have to be lighter, have to be, latest and greatest. I just don't think that that's necessary for a lot of riders, and I think for a lot of us, we don't get to the limit of our equipment. We're simply not putting out enough power. So if something has like a torsional rating, to 1,000 watts, but we're functionally pedaling between 150 and 200, it's just a little bit that the technology and the materials are far beyond what we need. So I would say the fit needs to be good, the integrity of the upper and the integrity of the sole needs to be good, and they could be absolutely fine. So same rules would apply. Make sure the fit is good, make sure the quality is good, the cleats are good, and to that point, I prefer him on 7-year-old shoes with good footbeds and a nice pedal cleat interface than brand new shoes, no footbeds and a worn cleat.
Great. Thank you for your question, Tim. We're moving to the front end of the bike. He consistently gets finger numbness after about an hour. fit issue, positioning issue, soft tissue?
Yeah, it can be a bit, again, you're kind of alluding to the areas that would like spark that. You know, well, I'm presuming it's probably a road position, although some people could get it in an aero position. On the road position, basically you've got to think about the ulnar nerve, and you've got to think about the angulation of the wrist. So how articulated, how bent is your wrist? And is the hood position, is it suitable to the kind of hand position that will be most neutral for the rider? So I think let's work from the front end back. Yes, like the height of the front end in relation to the saddle, yes, the reach can have an impact on it. But you also need to make sure that the rider isn't sitting too far forward. If the rider is sitting too far forward, it can put too much weight on the front end. So we would need to kind of look at the fit holistically, or look at it all to make sure. But let's just assume that the saddle was in the right position. Then you'd look at the height and reach of the hood, where it is, the angle of the hood, and you'd have to like go through those steps first. And the next thing that I would say to riders is, it does make sense to wear gloves. It does make sense to have a good shaped bar. Some bars, particularly if they're a little bit older, can be very narrow and they can force a lot of pressure into the lateral side of your hand. And the other thing as well is, don't overlook tire pressure, you know, because a lot of us are riding very stiff bikes, high performing wheels, and we're just simply putting too much tire pressure under us. So we're feeling absolutely every vibration. So look at the tires you're riding. There's a bicycle rolling resistance website. Most of the tire manufacturers have guidelines for your weight against their tires. Make sure you're in the right tire pressure as well.
Great. One final question, actually, and it's a personal question from me as we wrap up. What are some common injuries that we should, from a cycling standpoint, we should be cognizant of? I know that there's a battery of running niggles that happen. You know, in 2011, I was diagnosed with external iliac arteriopathy. I was getting no blood flow to my leg, and they thought that it was either perhaps a function of my saddle being too high or my crank length being too long. I don't know that we'll ever know, but that was a mysterious diagnosis at the time. More common now. And then what other injuries should we be thinking about?
Yeah, you know, it's the one that scares us when you think of like iliac artery kinking and issues like that, and your leg going numb. And yeah, that's the one that'll scare us, and quite rightly. And it does. It's a very, you think of Melissa Hochschild, her jersey's up here on the wall, and she's had 3 operations on the likes of that. And it's right to get our attention. But the common ones, when you think of running, cycling doesn't tend to be different, and us as humans don't tend to be different. We tend to get more posterior chain injuries than we do anterior. So in runners, they've got Achilles and calves and hamstrings and hamstring attachments. In riders, we tend to have hamstrings and lower back issues, tend to be a lot of our kind of challenges. So I would say, look, managing hamstring length or managing posterior chain length, it just makes sense. So I would say hamstrings and lower back, and most riders, you know, we're all quick to jump on the bike and get out the door, and you've got so much crap to get ready between your Garmin and your bottles and your shoes and this, that, and the other, that very, if any, riders do any type of mobility work before they get out. And particularly multi-sport athletes, when you think of like the fascia, the myofascial tension that riders are under, and they just hop on bikes, 15, 20-minute warm-up, and then boom, they're into their pieces of work. I think they would be extremely well served by just, you know, doing a little bit of foam rolling, a little bit of hip opener work, and a little bit of kind of posterior chain length before they head out on the bike, because it will allow them to hold better posture. And where we see compensations on riders on bikes is like these poor rounded positions. And these poor rounded positions tend to be tight hamstrings affecting the lower back, tight thoracic affecting the shoulders and neck. So if you can target those areas by supine foam rolling, where you're laying on your back and you're just rolling like that on your back, rolling your lats, rolling your T-spine, roll your quads and roll your hip flexors, and then just do a little bit of hip openers, which are like, front lunges, and just really get those hips to begin to open. I think that then when you get on the bike, you're just going to be under a little less stress to hold good posture. So looking out for those injuries, that's a little bit of a kind of a prehab, is if you could get into a routine of even only 5 minutes before you ride, it would help an awful lot.
Ivan, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for your questions. IvanOGorman.com is the website. He does offer virtual consults and is coming to San Francisco in December for some in-person. And then of course, they also have a booth in the expo as well with some videos that go through a lot of your services as well, including an Aero Fit with Sam Appleton. So thanks again, Ivan. And all right, everybody. In fact, we've got 30 more minutes of Mike Olzinski's activation session on the main stage. So let's go look at that posterior chain. Thank you.
There'll be some overlap there, that's for sure.
Yes,
all right.
Thank you. All right. Good day.